The moment cut straight through the routine fog of a Washington hearing and landed like a clean strike on a glass table. John Kennedy didn't raise his voice or dress the question in legal poetry.
I want to ask you about the Epstein files. Have you seen the Epstein files?
I have not reviewed the entirety of it myself, but a good amount.
He simply leaned in and asked what millions of people have been wondering out loud for years. Across from him, Kash Patel kept the practice posture of a man used to cameras, committees, and carefully measured words. The exchange was brief, but it had that rare electricity where everyone in the room senses something unscripted is unfolding. I've watched a lot of hearings, and most pass like background noise, yet this one had a pulse you could feel through the screen. The setting itself was familiar theater, a Judiciary Committee session drifting through budgets, staffing charts, and the kind of procedural talk that usually empties living rooms. Reporters typed half-heartedly, aides shuffled papers, and senators took turns performing oversight with polite restraint. Patel handled earlier questions with the steady cadence of a seasoned official, offering answers that sounded complete while revealing very little. He checked his watch once or twice, relaxed in the rhythm of predictable exchanges. If there was a misread in the room, it might have been the assumption that the afternoon would stay ordinary. Kennedy's turn arrived late in the session, and he spoke with that unhurried Louisiana drawl that can sound homespun until you realize how precise it is. He didn't circle the topic. He named it plainly and steered the room toward Jeffrey Epstein, a subject that still hangs heavy in public memory. The temperature seemed to change, subtle but real, like when a summer storm rolls in without thunder. Patel stayed composed, offering a familiar line about prior testimony and completed investigations. Kennedy cut in gently, signaling he wasn't interested in rehearsals, only in what remained unsaid. A thin folder rested under Kennedy's hand as if it were a bookmark in a story he already knew by heart. He asked for a number, not an essay, and pressed for a rough count of documents connected to the Epstein case. Patel hesitated, noting the difficulty of quantifying internal records without a database in front of him. Kennedy responded with figures his office had gathered through formal requests, suggesting thousands of documents remained withheld. Patel acknowledged that the estimate sounded generally consistent, and the air grew noticeably tighter. Then came the comparison that made the room lean forward, a small fraction released, the vast majority still unseen. Patel spoke of redactions, privacy, and sensitivities tied to investigations and individuals. Kennedy noted that the principal figures were no longer active subjects, raising the question of what exactly required continued protection. Patel referenced ancillary matters still under review, language that felt both official and opaque. Kennedy, with a faint smile, asked for plain English, the kind that travels beyond committee walls. If the main case is closed, he wondered, what are these side matters guarding, and for whom? Patel maintained that specifics couldn't be discussed publicly, which is a standard boundary in federal work. Kennedy nodded, then shifted the frame, asking about document classifications since Patel assumed leadership. Patel said he wasn't aware of any systematic reclassification, a careful phrase that left room on both sides. Kennedy produced an internal memo and asked whether he should read it aloud. The paper, dated weeks after Patel took office, described materials once cleared for release being redesignated and removed from a public queue. Patel answered cautiously, emphasizing process and risk assessments rather than motives. Kennedy pointed out that multiple layers of review had previously occurred, implying the bar for reversal was high. What changed, he asked, that turned once cleared pages into sensitive ones again? Patel spoke of evolving methodologies and updated evaluations, language that sounded prudent yet abstract. Then the questions narrowed further, focusing on whether anyone outside the Bureau had urged reconsideration. Patel emphasized independence and routine coordination across agencies, declining to frame conversations as directives. Names surfaced, including Donald Trump and individuals connected to him, and the inquiry became more pointed. Patel responded with generalities about professional communications, avoiding direct yes or no formulations. Kennedy pressed, repeating the question in simpler terms, as if sanding away every edge case. There was a pause long enough to make silence feel like a character in the story. Patel said he would need to review logs to provide a complete accounting, which is reasonable in complex roles but unsatisfying in tense moments. Kennedy countered that some conversations are memorable by their gravity alone. The exchange stayed civil, yet the subtext was unmistakable: clarity versus caution, immediacy versus procedure. I found myself thinking how often public trust hinges not on what is said, but on how directly it's said. Kennedy introduced a call record indicating contact with a law firm known for representing high-profile clients. Patel replied that he speaks with many attorneys as part of his duties, a statement that can be both true and incomplete depending on context. The timing drew attention, occurring near the period when document statuses shifted. Kennedy framed it as a sequence that raised eyebrows, not a verdict carved in stone. Patel rejected any suggestion that integrity had been compromised, holding to institutional lines. What followed felt less like accusation and more like competing narratives about coincidence and process. Kennedy laid out dates and documents, inviting viewers to connect dots for themselves. Patel emphasized lawful discretion and professional judgment, resisting simplified conclusions. The contrast was stark, one side presenting a timeline, the other presenting guardrails. As a viewer, I couldn't help noticing how both approaches appeal to different instincts: curiosity on one hand, caution on the other. The final stretch centered on whether certain materials might exist, not what they contained. Patel declined to discuss classified content in open session, which aligns with protocol. Kennedy clarified he wasn't asking for secrets, only for confirmation of existence, a subtle but meaningful distinction. Patel chose not to answer in that setting, a decision that carries its own message without stating one. Kennedy turned to the audience beyond the room, suggesting people would draw their own conclusions. Technically, the hearing continued, but the emotional peak had passed. Other topics returned: budgets, threats, administrative matters. Yet the earlier exchange lingered like an echo. Clips spread quickly across news feeds, analysts parsing tone as much as text. Legal commentators debated what could be inferred and what should remain speculative. In my view, moments like this don't resolve controversies. They refract them into sharper public questions. Was it a clash of transparency and responsibility, or simply two professionals bound by different obligations? Did the timeline imply more than coincidence, or did it reflect the messy choreography of large institutions? Viewers bring their own priors, and those priors shape what feels persuasive. I try to keep a healthy skepticism in both directions, wary of easy narratives. Still, I understand why the exchange struck a nerve. Kennedy's style blends courtroom cadence with back porch plainness, a combination that travels well on camera. Patel's approach reflects the guarded discipline of national security work, where saying less can be a virtue. Put them together and you get friction, sometimes illuminating, sometimes frustrating. It's the kind of democratic tension that can either clarify or cloud depending on how it's handled. And yes, there's a faint irony when bureaucracy meets folksy bluntness and neither fully yields. I don't claim to know what sits inside sealed folders, and I'm cautious about filling gaps with assumptions. But I do think public institutions earn confidence when explanations feel proportional to the questions asked. When answers stay high level while questions get granular, people notice. That doesn't prove anything by itself, yet perception has weight in civic life. The optics become part of the story whether anyone intends them to be or not. There's also the human factor: memory, workload, the limits of recall under pressure. Senior officials juggle endless briefings and conversations, and precision can suffer in real time. At the same time, some topics carry such gravity that the public expects crisp recollection. Navigating that expectation gap is part of modern governance. Watching it unfold can be both fascinating and uncomfortable. If I had to sum up the scene, I'd say it was less about a single answer and more about competing philosophies of disclosure. One philosophy says sunlight is the default and secrecy the exception. The other says protection is the default and disclosure the exception. Most systems live somewhere in between, negotiating trade-offs case by case. The hearing exposed that negotiation in real time, and maybe that's why it resonated beyond policy circles. People recognize when stakes feel larger than the paperwork on the table. They sense when language shifts from routine to consequential. They notice when a refusal to answer is itself an answer of a different kind. None of that requires certainty about outcomes, only attentiveness to tone and timing. A little dry humor floated through the exchange too, the kind that eases tension without trivializing it. Kennedy's metaphors carried a wink. Patel's restraint carried a professional stoicism. It was political theater, sure, but not the cartoonish kind. It felt grounded in process, even when emotions edged in. Sometimes that mix is what keeps viewers from looking away. In the end, I'm left with questions rather than conclusions, and I think that's healthy. Questions about process, about transparency, about how institutions balance openness with obligation. Questions about how much the public deserves to know and when. Questions about how narratives form in the space between facts and silence. Those questions don't accuse, they invite scrutiny. Whether future hearings clarify the picture or add more layers remains to be seen. For now, the exchange stands as a snapshot of oversight in action, imperfect and revealing at once. I'll keep watching with a skeptical eye and an open mind. Democracy, at its best, is a conversation that doesn't end in a single afternoon, and sometimes the most telling moments are the ones where everyone pauses and listens to what wasn't said. What makes exchanges like this linger is not just the headline moment, but the ripple effect that follows when institutions, reputations, and public expectations intersect. In the hours after the hearing, commentators replayed the Kennedy-Patel dialogue frame by frame, analyzing tone, pauses, and phrasing with the intensity usually reserved for championship games. John Kennedy became for some viewers the embodiment of plainspoken oversight, while Kash Patel represented the guarded discipline of federal procedure. Neither caricature tells the whole story, but both capture a slice of how audiences interpret political theater. And interpretation, fair or not, often shapes the broader narrative as much as documented facts. It's worth remembering that congressional hearings are structured arenas with rules, time limits, and competing priorities. Senators pursue clarity, agency leaders protect processes that don't always translate neatly to public sound bites. Kennedy's questions were short and pointed, designed to land cleanly on television and in transcripts. Patel's answers leaned on institutional language that signals caution and continuity rather than spectacle. When those styles collide, friction is almost inevitable. The Epstein case adds another layer because it sits at the intersection of law enforcement, public curiosity, and unresolved historical memory. People still debate timelines, decisions, and what transparency should look like years after the fact. That background turns even procedural questions into emotionally charged moments. I don't see that as inherently political, I see it as human. High-profile events linger in collective memory, and people want reassurance that systems worked as intended. Kennedy seemed to understand that emotional backdrop and framed his line of questioning accordingly. He avoided sprawling hypotheticals and kept returning to counts, dates, and sequences. Patel, for his part, stayed anchored to institutional norms, classification protocols, privacy considerations, and ongoing reviews. From one angle, it's a debate about numbers and paperwork. From another, it's a debate about trust and how much sunlight is enough. The conversation also revealed a tension between immediacy and deliberation. Viewers want crisp answers in real time. Agencies operate on layered reviews that don't always fit the tempo of live hearings. That mismatch can create suspicion even when none is warranted. It's a classic governance paradox. Transparency is vital, but so is the careful handling of sensitive material. Striking the right balance is harder than it looks on a highlight reel. Some analysts pointed out that Kennedy's approach mirrors courtroom strategy, where establishing a timeline can be more persuasive than delivering a lecture. Patel's approach resembles executive testimony, where precision and restraint are safeguards against misstatement. Neither style is inherently superior, Each serves a different function. But in a media-saturated environment, the courtroom cadence often wins the moment. It's built for clarity, contrast, and recall. Names like Donald Trump inevitably amplify the stakes because they bring national polarization into any discussion. Mentioning prominent figures raises the temperature, even when the questions are framed carefully. Patel's reluctance to answer certain formulations can be read as procedural fidelity or strategic caution, depending on one's perspective. Kennedy's persistence can be read as principled oversight or tactical pressure. The same scene supports multiple interpretations. What I find instructive is how quickly the conversation moved from specifics to symbolism. The withheld versus released document ratio became a shorthand for transparency debates across agencies. The call log became a proxy for questions about access and influence in Washington. The refusal to answer in an open setting became a Rorschach test for viewers' expectations. None of those elements proves a conclusion by itself, but together they frame the public mood. There's also the practical reality that classification systems are complex and sometimes frustratingly opaque. Decisions are rarely binary. They involve layered risk assessments and evolving standards. A document cleared at one stage can be reconsidered if circumstances change. That's not inherently suspicious, but it does demand clear explanation to avoid misunderstanding. Communication gaps can look like concealment even when they're not. Kennedy's rhetorical style thrives in those gaps because it translates complexity into digestible contrasts. He asks, "What changed?" A question that resonates with anyone who's experienced shifting rules. Patel responds with references to methodology and consultation, which are accurate but abstract. The tension between plain language and technical language becomes part of the story. And once it's part of the story, it shapes perception. Another factor is the modern feedback loop between hearings and digital platforms. Short clips circulate faster than full transcripts, and tone often outruns context. A single pause can be replayed 1,000 times, divorced from surrounding nuance. That's not inherently good or bad, it's simply how information travels now. But it does mean officials are judged as much on delivery as on substance. I also think it's healthy to distinguish between unanswered questions and proven claims. A refusal to discuss classified material is not the same as an admission of wrongdoing. At the same time, persistent ambiguity can erode confidence if it isn't paired with transparent process. The public deserves clarity about procedures even when details must remain protected. Explaining the why behind limits can go a long way. From a governance standpoint, oversight works best when both sides acknowledge legitimate constraints. Legislators should press for accountability. Agencies should explain guardrails without sounding evasive. When that mutual recognition breaks down, hearings become adversarial performances rather than collaborative inquiries. The Kennedy-Patel exchange hovered on that boundary. It was sharp, but it stayed within formal decorum. Observers also noted how institutional memory plays a role. Leadership transitions can bring new perspectives on risk and disclosure. A change in methodology doesn't automatically imply motive, but it does warrant explanation. People want to know why standards evolve and how decisions are reviewed. That's not suspicion, it's civic curiosity. In that sense, the hearing became a case study in public administration under scrutiny. How do agencies communicate complexity without losing clarity? How do lawmakers translate oversight into questions that resonate beyond the committee room? These are not partisan questions, they're structural ones. The answers shape how democracy feels to the people watching. There's a subtle irony here, too. The same systems designed to protect sensitive information can, if poorly explained, make people feel shut out. And the same demands for openness can, if poorly framed, pressure officials to oversimplify. Navigating that tightrope requires discipline and empathy on both sides. It's less about winning an exchange and more about sustaining trust. Kennedy's closing posture, letting viewers draw their own conclusions, underscored that dynamic. Patel's adherence to setting appropriate limits underscored it from the other side. Neither move settles the debate, but both define the terrain. The conversation shifts from who's right to how should this work. That's a more durable question. Looking ahead, follow-up hearings and document reviews will likely shape the next chapter. Oversight is iterative by design. One session rarely resolves everything. What matters is whether processes become clearer and communication improves. Public confidence grows when institutions show their work. Even incremental transparency can make a difference. I also think it's important to resist the urge to treat every tense moment as a verdict. Democratic systems are messy, and friction is part of accountability. A tough question doesn't equal a final answer. A cautious response doesn't equal a cover story. The space between those extremes is where responsible judgment lives. For viewers trying to make sense of it all, focusing on verifiable steps helps. What procedures govern classification? Who reviews decisions? What timelines apply to disclosures? These process questions are less dramatic than sound bites, but they're more illuminating. They ground the conversation in how institutions actually function. At the same time, storytelling matters. People connect with narratives that feel coherent and human. Kennedy's framing provided a narrative arc. Patel's responses provided institutional context. Ideally, those elements meet in the middle. When they don't, audiences fill gaps with their own assumptions. I find it useful to keep a dual lens, empathy for institutional constraints and insistence on public accountability. Both can coexist, both are necessary. Lean too far in either direction and the picture distorts. There's also a generational dimension to expectations around transparency. Digital native audiences are accustomed to instant access and real-time updates. Government processes move more deliberately. Bridging that cultural gap requires clearer explanations and better public literacy about procedures. Otherwise, mismatched expectations fuel mistrust. Ultimately, the Kennedy-Patel moment wasn't a finale. It was a prompt to revisit how oversight is conducted and communicated. A prompt to ask whether existing frameworks serve today's transparency norms. A prompt to remember that skepticism and fairness should travel together. That balance keeps debate constructive. As for the broader political environment, high-profile names will always amplify attention. But attention doesn't have to mean accusation. It can mean scrutiny, and scrutiny can be healthy. The goal isn't to rush to judgment. It's to ensure questions are addressed with integrity. That's the standard worth defending. If future sessions clarify timelines, methodologies, and review mechanisms, much of the tension may ease. If they don't, the questions will persist. Either way, the process should remain visible and comprehensible. Democracy works best when people understand not just outcomes, but procedures. Transparency is as much about process as it is about content. In my view, the exchange reaffirmed that oversight is a living practice, not a ceremonial ritual. It demands preparation, precision, and patience. It also demands humility, an acknowledgement that complex systems rarely yield simple answers. That humility can coexist with firm questioning. In fact, it should. So I'm watching for substance over spectacle, process over punchlines. I want clearer explanations, consistent standards, and timely updates. I want officials to feel comfortable saying what they can and clear about why they can't say more. That's not too much to ask in a system built on public trust. And it's a goal that transcends any single hearing or headline.